No. She's right here. She actually sat down next to me. I know. Listen. You know how some people just look like they shouldn't be allowed in certain spaces? Like their whole body is an apology for being somewhere it doesn't belong? That's what I'm looking at right now. It's not even a smell thing. It's a presence thing. Like when a stray gets into a restaurant. You don't hate the animal. You just know, with every fiber of your being, that it is in the wrong place. And someone failed to do their job by letting it through the door. He laughed. Loud. At something the person on the phone said. Yeah. Exactly. First class. I know. I'm going to see what I can do. Hold on. He put the phone against his chest and turned to look at Yemi. The way you look at a thing that has been brought to your attention by someone else and is now, unfortunately, your problem to deal with. You're in the wrong seat. I'm in Doi. Yemi said. That's my seat. He looked at her for another second. Then he put the phone back to his ear and said, I'll call you when I land. And hung up, and started looking for a flight attendant. Yemi Oduya finished putting her bag in the overhead. Sat down in 2C. Took out the notebook she always traveled with soft cover. Worn at the corners. 40 years of the same kind, and opened it to the page she'd been working on before the taxi. She did not think about him after that. She thought about the sequence. She had been working on the same sequence for 11 years. She had it nearly right. She was going to have it fully right by the time this flight landed. Or she was going to understand, finally, why it was not a solvable problem. And that would be its own answer. And either answer was acceptable to a woman who had spent 40 years learning to sit with not yet. In 4 hours and 53 minutes, over the blank dark water between here and there, a man in this cabin was going to stop breathing. And the man who had just hung up his phone, and the woman who had said, on the other end of that phone, yes, exactly. Someone failed to do their job times. All of them were going to be alive when this airplane landed, entirely because of what Yemi Oduya had spent 40 years becoming, and because of what she was carrying in the soft, worn notebook, and because of what her grandmother had said to her when Yemi was 9 years old and too afraid to move her queen. She was not afraid of that anymore. But we're getting ahead of things. To understand what happened at 31,000 feet over the black middle of the Atlantic that night, why a man's brain did not die, why an airplane full of people who had silently agreed that a woman didn't belong in their orbit came down through the cloud with all of them breathing, you have to go back. Not 4 hours, 40 years. You have to go back to a girl named Yemi, 9 years old, in a community center in Brixton, South London, sitting across a chessboard from her grandmother, Mama Titi, who had carried the game from Lagos in 1963 in a wooden box with a broken latch, and who was beating Yemi for the 17th time in a row, and who said, when Yemi's queen fell, the queen is not the most powerful piece because she can go anywhere. She is the most powerful piece because she sees everywhere. You have to see where your opponent is going before they go there. You have to live 3 moves ahead. Her name is Dr. Adeyemi Yemi Oduya. She is 51 years old. And on the night this story happens, she is a competitive chess grandmaster, the first black woman to hold the title, which she earned when she was 34, and which she has held through the specific grinding, unglamorous, relentless work of remaining the best in the world at a game that will eat you alive the moment you stop feeding it your full attention. Hold on to that. The seeing. The living 3 moves ahead. Because in less than 5 hours, A man's body was going to move 3 moves ahead of everything anyone expected. And Yemi was going to be the only person in the cabin who had spent 40 years learning to see what was coming before it arrived. But at 8 at night, none of them knew that. All they saw was the notebook. Let me tell you about the notebook. Because Philip Crane spent a good minute of his life performing contempt at a woman holding it, and it is worth knowing what was inside it. It was a soft-cover composition notebook, navy blue, the same brand she had used since she was 14. The corners were worn to the cardboard. There was a coffee ring on the front cover from a cup in Reykjavik 4 years ago, and a faint smear on the back from a hotel room in Tbilisi where someone had been cooking something that smelled of cumin. It was the 43rd notebook of this kind she had filled. And inside it, in the specific, dense handwriting that she had developed across 40 years of filling notebooks, was a sequence, not a game, a theoretical sequence, the kind of position that had not been played and might never be played, and that existed entirely in the realm of what was possible, rather than what had been. She had been building toward it for 11 years, moving through the permutations the way a mathematician moved through a proof, testing and rejecting and adjusting, looking for the line that resolved into something that was not solvable by any known method and not susceptible to any engine analysis she had run on it. And she was close. She was very close. She had been close before, in a way that turned out not to be close. And she had learned, from those close that were not, to mistrust the feeling of proximity. But this time she had 11 years of architecture underneath it. And the architecture held. And she thought the line was real. She thought about nothing else for most of the flight. There was another thing in the notebook. Tucked in the back behind the elastic band, a photograph, worn soft, of a woman in her 70s laughing at something off camera in a room that smelled, if you knew the room, of jolliffe and cedar and the specific smell of old wooden chess pieces. Mama Titi, who had died 8 years ago, who had taught Yemi the Queen on a board in a Brixton community center, and who had, in the 43 years between that lesson and her death, not once let Yemi believe that the game she was playing was a game. It is not a game. Mama Titi had said, when Yemi was 12 and starting to understand how good she was, starting to think about what good meant. A game is a thing you play and then put away. What you are learning is how to see. You will use it everywhere. Every room you walk into, every person you sit across from you will see the lines they are running. 3 moves ahead. And you will know what to do. This is not a skill for a board. This is a skill for a life. She had used it everywhere. She had used it in the 17 Grandmaster title matches she had played, and the 12 she had won, and the 5 she had lost, and the losses she had learned more from than the wins. She had used it in the classroom where she taught 2 days a week, at a community center in Brixton, not far from the original one. A classroom full of 11-year-olds who did not yet know they were learning to see. She had used it in the rooms where people had decided, in the 30 seconds after she walked in, that she was not what the room was for, and where she had sat down and understood, in the 40 seconds after that, exactly what the room was for and what she needed to do. She had used it everywhere. She was using it now. She opened the notebook to the sequence and got back to work. Here is what Philip Crane did not know, now explaining his displeasure to a flight attendant named Curtis at the front of the boarding area. And here is what the woman in 2B, whose name was Harriet Mole, 53, something in investment management, who had said times like when a stray gets into a restaurant, times to Philip, on the phone before she boarded, and then sat down in 2B and looked at Yemi with the specific cool assessment of a woman who has appraised a great many things, and found most of them wanting, did not know. That Yemi had learned chess from her grandmother in a community center in Brixton in 1983 and had won her first tournament at 13 and her first national title at 19 and had lost the first world championship match at 26 and won the second at 28 and had been number one in the world for 17 of the last 23 years. With the 4 years she wasn't being, the years she spent studying what had beaten her and building the answer to it, that she had, in those 17 years, at the top, played 11,000 competitive games, which was not the number that impressed people, but was the number that mattered. 11,000 games of sustained, pressured, high-stakes analytical problem-solving in real time, against the best minds in the world, in positions that had never existed before and would never exist again. With the specific requirement that she see what was coming before it came and know what to do before there was time to think about what to do. That she had won the World Chess Championship 5 times. That the last time she had won it, in Vienna 3 years ago, the president of FIDE had shaken her hand and said, in the way that men said these things, "You are a credit to your country." And she had said, in the way she said these things, "I'm a credit to my work." And she had gone back to the hotel and opened the notebook and worked on the sequence because the work did not stop for ceremonies. That she was on this flight because she had been in New York for a memorial for a fellow grandmaster, Alexei Petrov, who had died of a heart attack at 62, and who had been one of the 6 people alive who understood what Yemi was trying to do with the sequence, and who had spent 8 hours with her in a hotel room in Zurich 3 years ago, going through the first 40 moves of it and saying, at the end, "This is either the most important thing happening in chess right now or the most elaborate mistake I've ever seen. I cannot tell you which. Keep going." She was going to London to visit Alexei's widow, Nadia, who had been her friend for 20 years, and who had called her the day Alexei died and said only, "Come when you can." She was coming. She was also thinking about the sequence, because she was always thinking about the sequence. Because the sequence was not a thing you put down and picked up. It was a thing that lived in the part of your mind that was always running, the part that did not sleep, the part that was working the problem in the background of every other thing you were doing. She was 51 years old, and she had spent 40 years becoming this, and she was sitting in 2C with the notebook open and the sequence almost right. And Philip Crane had told someone on the phone that she looked like a stray in a restaurant. She was thinking about the sequence. Curtis, the flight attendant, was 44. 14 years in the air, and he had the specific position of a man who had been asked to do a thing he did not want to do, by a man who was the kind of man who generated complaint letters about a woman who had said nothing and done nothing and was in her assigned seat. He had the specific look of someone doing the math on complaint letters versus what was right. The math was not complicated, but it was math that took time. And in the meantime, he had arrived at 2C with Philip Crane, 3 steps behind him, and had said, with the careful neutrality of a man not yet committed, "Dr. Oduya, I just wanted to check. I'm in Doi," Yemi said, without looking up. "The confirmation is in my email if you'd like to see it." "No. That's fine." Curtis straightened up. He was making the decision in real time. And he was making the right one. And he was not entirely comfortable with making it because making it had costs. And he was thinking about the costs. "Mr. Crane, your seat is 2A, which is the window on the left. Dr. Oduya is in 2C, the aisle on the right. Those are separate seats." "I understand they're separate seats," Philip said. "I'm asking whether there's any availability elsewhere. I had specifically requested a row to myself." And the flight is fully booked, Curtis said. I'm sorry. There aren't other options. He did not say times for either of you, which would have been a way of distributing the offer. The way these things were sometimes distributed. He just said there weren't other options and went back to his work. And Philip Crane stood in the aisle for a moment and then sat down in 2A, which was where he belonged, and did not say anything else. Yemi did not acknowledge any of it. She was 3 moves into the variation she'd been resisting looking at for 2 weeks. And she was already seeing why she'd been resisting it. And the seeing was worth more to her than the situation with Philip Crane. From 3A, behind her, a man's voice. Quiet. Direct. Nicely done. By the way. She did not turn around. Which part? The part where you just waited. She almost smiled. It's a chess thing. What is? Knowing when the position resolves itself without you, she turned around now. The man was in his late 50s. Broad. With the careful, unhurried quality of a man who had spent his life in rooms where the wrong move cost more than a game. His name, she would learn, was Bernard Achebe, no relation to anyone relevant. Just the surname she would not have let pass uncommented if she'd been meeting him anywhere else. But this was an airplane, and he'd said the right thing, and she had the sequence to think about. He was a civil engineer, as it turned out, bridges and tunnels. The man who decided in the specific technical language that only civil engineers used, whether a thing held. A chess player, he said. Grandmaster, she said, not with performance, just the accurate word. He nodded. The specific nod of a man filing information correctly. I thought you looked like someone who was doing geometry. My wife plays. Not at that level. But she has that look. What look? The look of someone who's somewhere else while they're here. She smiled properly this time. The sequence, she said. I've been working on it for 11 years. I'm close. What's the sequence? A theoretical chess position. A line of play that, if it's correct, doesn't resolve the way chess positions are supposed to resolve. It just keeps going, indefinitely. Or it contains a win that's invisible by any current analysis method. She paused. I'm trying to determine which. Bernard looked at her. He was a man who understood the specific pleasure of working on a problem that didn't resolve, that kept demanding more of you, that refused to be finished. He said, How do you know when you're close? When I start being afraid to look at certain variations, she said. The ones I keep avoiding are usually the ones with the answer in them. He nodded again. Bridges do that, he said. There's always a load case you keep not running because you're afraid of what it says. He sat back. Run it. I'm going to, she said, and turned back to the notebook. Harriet Mole, in 2B, had been on her phone since before Philip started on his. She was in the specific mode of a woman for whom airplane time was work time emails. The blinking app. The specific, efficient churn of a mind that processed information in the format of financial instruments and produced nothing that she would have called feeling. She had been the one on the phone with. Philip had seen Yemi board first and had said the thing about the stray getting into the restaurant, which she believed, and which she had said in the particular tone of a woman stating an observation rather than an opinion, as though what she was saying were simply the accurate description of a visible fact. She had the specific variety of cruelty that did not think of itself as cruelty. It was, in Harriet's internal accounting, simply accuracy. She was accurate about value. She assessed things correctly. The woman in 2C was not worth her attention. And she had said so. And she was now back on her email. Because her attention was finite, and she gave it where it returned. She would spend the rest of her life knowing that she had said a woman looked like a stray in a restaurant. The day before, that woman became the only reason Harriet Mole got off a plane alive. But that was tomorrow's problem. In tray, diagonally behind Yemi, a young woman named Adaize, 26, a medical student finishing her residency in London, going home to visit her parents. She had heard everything. She had been watching since Philip started performing for his phone. And she had the expression of someone who was working out the specific equation between what she had just witnessed and what, if anything, she should do about it. She had done nothing. She was still working out the equation. She was going to have a chance to do something later. When the chance came, she was going to take it. And she was going to take it well. And that is worth knowing about her now. Before the later comes. In the window seat next to Bernard, Tree B, an old man, 79, sparse white hair. A canvas bag on his lap that he was holding with both hands, the way people held things that mattered. His name was Professor Kweku Mensah, and he had been a mathematics professor at Cambridge for 38 years. And he had retired 6 years ago. And he had been at the memorial for Alexei Petrov because Alexei had been one of the 12 people he had ever known who understood a particular piece of mathematics that connected in a way that was not yet fully visible to the work Yemi was doing in her notebook. He had not introduced himself yet. He was watching her work. He had been watching her work since she opened the notebook at the gate. Before any of the Philip Crane situation, he had the specific recognition of a mathematician who has seen in the posture and the focus and the specific way a person moves through material that they are close to something. He knew the look. He had worn the look for 3 years in 1987, working on the problem that became his most cited paper. And he had seen it on 3 other people in his life. And he was seeing it now. He was not going to say anything yet. He was going to wait. Waiting was a thing mathematicians did. The flight was 2 hours and 40 minutes in 10 at night. The Atlantic, below and invisible and enormous, when the man in 14B had the seizure. There was no warning. Or there was no warning that the people around him recognized in time. He was 57. His name was Graham. He was flying home from a business trip. He had drunk 2 glasses of wine at dinner. He had been fine until he wasn't. Until the specific not fine of a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, which began as a stiffening and became a shaking and became the particular violence of a body turning against itself in a seat at 31,000 feet. And his wife, in 14A, did not know what to do, and the man in 14C had never seen one, and the flight attendant, Sienna, who was 23 and had been in the job 8 months, arrived, and also did not know what to do. She went for Yemi. This requires explanation. She did not go for Yemi because she knew Yemi was a grandmaster. She went for Yemi because, at the boarding area situation, the Philip Crane situation, the Curtis situation, Sienna had been in the back of the boarding area and had seen the whole thing, and had watched Curtis handle it correctly, and had watched Yemi sit down and open her notebook without a word. And she had thought, that's someone who's been here before. And when she came back through the cabin at the start of the flight, she had stopped at 2C and said, "Can I get you anything?" with the specific inflection of a question that was also an acknowledgement. And Yemi had looked up and said, "Tea, please, no milk." and that had been the extent of it. But Sienna had registered her. She had registered her the way young people registered, people who moved through the world without noise, who did not need anything from the room, who had the specific self-possession of someone who had been exactly where they were for a very long time. When 14B started seizing, Sienna did not panic. She did what she did, which was to ask the cabin if there was a doctor, and to page, and to also go, herself, to the woman in 2C, because the woman in 2C was someone who would know what to do. She did not know this. She believed it. Sometimes those are the same. Yemi was already standing. She had heard the sound, or rather, she had heard the sound of other people's reactions to the sound. The specific collective intake of a cabin that has realized something is wrong, and she had the specific advantage of someone who had spent 40 years learning to hear what was happening 3 seconds before it was visible. She said, "To Sienna, where? Part Bass B." She went. She was not a doctor. She said this clearly, the moment she arrived. So there was no confusion. "I'm not a doctor. I'm trained in first aid. What do we have?" Sienna told her. Attendant had already been moving from 3C, she had also heard. Had also stood. Had arrived at 14B, a step behind Yemi. She said, "I'm a physician. Residency in neurology." She was already kneeling. She had the calm of someone who had been in this exact situation in a hospital and was now translating the hospital procedure to an airplane seat. Yemi stepped back. This is the thing that a person who sees 3 moves ahead knows how to do. She stepped back, and she assessed, and she identified the specific thing that she could do that Attendant could not, which was not the medicine. Attendant had the medicine. But the room. The management of the room around the medicine. The 14 people in the surrounding seats who were frightened and in the way. The wife whose name she got immediately times. Carol times, and who needed someone to be with her. The man in 14C who had started filming and whom Yemi said, in a voice that admitted no negotiation, "Put the phone away. Right now." The cabin that had been reorganizing itself into the particular shape of a group of people watching a crisis, which was almost always a shape that made the crisis worse. She managed the room. She moved people. She spoke to Carol, who was 61 and had been married to Graham for 32 years. In the specific voice she used when she was playing in a losing position and needed to remain calm for the work, the voice that said, "I see the whole board. I know what is happening. You are safe to feel what you feel, because I am watching the position." She did not say those words. She used that voice. Graham came through the seizure. The active phase was 90 seconds. Attendant maintained his airway. Managed the space. Assessed the aftermath. He was confused, which was normal. He was tired, which was normal. His wife held his hand and Yemi held his wife's, and that was the shape of the thing. For a while, Attendant said, "To Yemi," quietly, while Graham was resting and Carol was talking to him. "You've done that before." "I've never seen a seizure before," Yemi said. Attendant looked at her. "Not the seizure. The room?" "Yes." Yemi said, "I've managed rooms before." Attendant said, "You're the chess player." "The Grand Master." "Yes." Attendant said, "I thought I recognized you. My aunt has a book about you." She paused. "She's going to lose her mind when I tell her about tonight." "Tell her the neurology resident did the work." Yemi said, "She did." "Tell me your aunt's name." Attendant said, "I'll mention it the next time I see her." Yemi looked at her. She said, What's her name? Chidinma. She's in Lagos. She taught herself chess from your grandmother's book. Yemi was quiet for a moment. Mama Titi wrote one book, she said. About the Queen? Most people don't know it. My aunt knows it, Ades said. She's read it 4 times. Tell your aunt, Yemi said, that Mama Titi's granddaughter says, hello, and that the Queen is still the most powerful piece. Adaeze smiled. She went back to monitoring Graham, who was going to need a follow-up at a hospital when they landed, but who was stable, who was with his wife, who had been through the worst part and come out the other side. Philip Crane, in 2A, had heard all of it. The paging, the movement, the voice that had said times, put the phone away times, and been obeyed immediately. He was not the kind of man who turned around to watch. So he had not turned around. But he had heard. He had heard the voice. A voice he recognized from the boarding. From the brief exchange with Curtis. A voice that had a specific quality that he could not quite name and that he did not want to examine too closely, and he had heard the cabin settle around it. He had not thought much about the woman in 2C since the boarding. He had said the thing on the phone, and then he had said the thing about the wrong seat, and then Curtis had handled it, and he had sat down and opened his own laptop and done his own work. Because he was a 54-year-old man in venture capital, and he had a term sheet to review, and the woman in 2C did not warrant his continued attention. He was thinking about her now. He was thinking about the specific arithmetic of the situation, which he was good at. He made his living on the arithmetic of situations, and the arithmetic was not comfortable. He had said, on the phone, she's right here. She doesn't look like she belongs. And the woman who was right there, who didn't look like she belonged, had walked to the back of the airplane and done the specific thing that the situation required. And the situation had required something specific, and she had had it. He was a man who assessed risk for a living. He had looked at the woman in 2C and assessed her as low value. He had been wrong about the assessment, and he knew it, and knowing it cost him something. And the thing it cost him was the comfortable certainty with which he had performed the assessment, which was a certainty he had been operating with for most of his adult life, and which he was now going to have to examine more carefully than he had ever examined it. He was not going to apologize to her. He did not yet know how to do that. And he was not going to do a thing he didn't know how to do badly. In public. On an airplane. But the examination was happening. Whether he wanted it or not, the examination was happening. Harriet Mole had not heard the specific words. She had been wearing noise-canceling headphones since before the seizure, but she had heard the shift in the cabin's pressure, the particular atmospheric change of a collective attention moving to a point, and she had taken the headphones off and asked the person in front of her what had happened. And the person in front of her had told her, and Harriet had sat with this information for a long time. She had the specific problem of a woman who had said a precise and cruel thing, and was now in the situation of having to live with the precision. She had said, it's not a smell thing. It's a presence thing. Like when a stray gets into a restaurant. She had said it with the confidence of a woman who was accurate about value, who had spent 30 years making correct assessments, who trusted her own eye. And her eye had looked at a 5-time world chess champion and seen a stray. She was going to spend a significant amount of time with this. She did not take the headphones back out. She sat in 2B with the information, and she did not run from it, which was, given who she was, a meaningful choice. Professor Mensah had left his seat during the seizure had gone, quietly, to the back of the cabin, and offered what he had, which was a calm and knowing presence in a space where calm and knowing were useful, and had come back when it was clear that the young doctor had it handled. He sat down, He looked at the notebook in Yemi's seat, which she had left open on the tray table when she stood. He had not looked at it. He was not the kind of man who read another person's work without invitation. When Yemi came back, he said, "How is the man?" "Stable," she said. "His wife is with him. The doctor is monitoring." She sat down. She looked at the open notebook. She had left it at move 43 of the variation she'd been resisting. And she had come back to it, and she could see, with the specific seeing, that the situation had cleared in her the adrenaline, the management of the room. The specific focus and release of an emergency handled the thing she had not been able to see before. She was quiet for a long moment. Professor Mensah said, "Have you found it?" She looked up. "I haven't introduced myself." "I know who you are," he said. "I was at Alexei's memorial. He talked about your sequence at dinner, the night before he died. He said it was either the most important thing happening in chess or the most elegant error he'd ever seen." He paused. He also said he believed it was real. Yemi looked at him. "Kweku Mensah," he said. "Mathematics. Cambridge. Retired." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "I've read your 1987 paper. The one about the convergence behavior of nonlinear sequences." "That paper," he said, "is why Alexei was talking about your sequence at dinner. He thought the convergence behavior you'd found was an instance of what I described, in a different domain." "I thought that too," she said. "I haven't been able to prove it." "Show me," he said. She turned the notebook toward him. What happened in the next 2 hours was not something that the other passengers of Flight 207 were aware of. They were aware that the woman in 2C and the old man in 3B were talking quietly, sometimes sketching things in the notebook, sometimes sitting in the specific silent motion of two people thinking beside each other. They were not aware of what was in the notebook, or what the old man had recognized in it, or what the conversation was about. What the conversation was about was this. Yemi had found the line. In the crisis, in the specific clarity of emergency, the room managed. The immediate danger passed. She had come back to the notebook and seen. In the variation she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. The move that resolved it. Not a win. Not a loss. A position that was neither. A position that kept going. Indefinitely. In a specific and structured and unpredictable way. A position that behaved like the non-linear sequence in Kweku Mensah's 1987 paper. That was neither periodic nor random, but something between, something that had not been named, something that was going to need to be named. She was not certain. Certainty in these things took time and verification and the specific scrutiny of people who wanted to be wrong and couldn't find it. But she thought she had it. She had been close for 11 years, and now she thought she had it. Kweku went through the first 60 moves with her. He asked questions. He raised the specific objections that a mathematician raised when presented with a claim not hostile, not dismissive. The honest interrogation of a man who wanted the thing to be real and was therefore testing it hardest. She answered the questions. Some of the answers required her to look at the notebook for a long time before she spoke. One of them required her to work through a variation she hadn't tried. Right there. In the margins. And Kweku watched her work and did not rush her. At the end of 2 hours, he said, "I can't find the error." "Neither can I," she said. "That's why I'm scared." "You should be scared," he said. "It's enormous. If it's right. It's also going to be the most scrutinized piece of chess theory since Fisher." He paused. "Alexei thought it was real." "Alexei died before he could tell me whether he'd found the error," she said. "He told me," Mensah said, 3 weeks before he died. He said he'd been looking for the error for 8 months and he couldn't find it. He said the position was doing something he didn't have the mathematics for. He looked at her. I might have the mathematics for it. Yemi was quiet. She said, "Will you help me?" "That's why I'm on this plane," he said. "Alexei asked me to. Before he died," he said, "if you run into Yemi Oduya and he knew I was going to the memorial, and he knew you were going, give her the paper I sent you. And then, if you think I'm right about the mathematics, help her." He reached into the canvas bag he'd been holding since the boarding. He took out a manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a paper, a draft. Handwritten. Alexei's handwriting, in the specific dense style of a man who thought faster than he wrote, with the title. In English. On the convergence properties of the Oduya sequence. She held it. She did not open it yet. She held it and she thought about Alexei, who had gone through the first 40 moves with her in a hotel room in Zurich 3 years ago and had said, "This is either the most important thing happening in chess right now or the most elaborate mistake I've ever seen." And who had, in the months after, apparently concluded that it was the first thing and had reached backward from chess into mathematics to find the language for why, and who had died before he could tell her. He had told Kweku. Kweku was on this plane. She opened the paper. She read it. Kweku watched her read. He was a man who had spent 38 years watching students read mathematics. And he could tell, from the specific quality of the stillness, when they had encountered something that was going to change the way they thought. He saw it now. She finished reading. She looked out the window. The Atlantic was below, enormous and black, and somewhere they were over it, and she could not see it. And it was there. She said, "He found the language." He did. She said, "It's real." "I believe it is," he said. "I need to go through it properly. But yes, I believe it's real." She sat with this. She said, "I started this when I was 40, 11 years ago. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew the position kept giving me something I couldn't explain." "The best problems do that," he said. "They resist long enough that by the time you solve them, you understand why they mattered. Mama Titi used to say, the queen is not the most powerful piece because she can go anywhere. She's the most powerful piece because she sees everywhere." Your grandmother. She taught me the game. She taught me to live 3 moves ahead. "What's the move ahead of this?" he said. Yemi looked at the paper. She looked at the notebook. She looked out at the black Atlantic. "Getting it verified?" she said. "Then publishing it. Then spending 5 years defending it against everyone who doesn't want it to be real. Because it's easier than accepting that a position like this exists." She paused, and then starting the next one. Kweku smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent 38 years in mathematics and recognized, in what she had just said, the particular disposition of a person who would be fine. They landed in London. Philip Crane walked off the plane without looking at Yemi. He was a man who did not know yet what he was going to do with what had happened on the flight. And because he did not know, he did nothing, which was what he usually did when he did not know. The knowing was going to come later. It was going to come in the form of the story his company's PR person sent him about a chess grandmaster who had managed a seizure emergency in a transatlantic cabin. And he was going to read it, and he was going to recognize the name. And the recognition was going to cost him something. It was going to cost him the comfortable certainty of his assessment, which he had already started paying for on the airplane, and which he was going to keep paying for, in small installments, for a long time. Harriet Mole walked off the plane and called the person she'd been on the phone with, the one she'd said the stray thing to. And she said, I need to tell you something about the woman on the plane. She told them. She did not tell it as an impressive story. She told it as a correction. She said, I said she looked like a stray, and I was wrong. And I want to be specific about the kind of wrong I was. The person on the other end was quiet for a moment, and then said, Why are you telling me this? And she said, Because you agreed with me. I want you to know I was wrong. So you have the correct information. That was the most that Harriet Mole was capable of. In that moment. It was more than most people managed. It was not enough. But it was what she had. And it was real. Adaise went to her parents' house in Islington. She called her Aunt Chidinma, in Lagos, at midnight, and said, I met her. I met Yemi Oduya. She said, to tell you, the Queen is still the most powerful piece. She heard. From Accra, her Aunt Chidinma, who had taught herself chess from a book by an old woman who had carried a wooden set from Lagos in 1963, the specific sound of a woman undone by joy. Graham and Carol, who had been moved to a row with more space and where Adaise could monitor him for the rest of the flight, came off the plane with the careful slowness of two people who had been reminded that the body was not permanent, and were therefore moving through the body's world with more attention. Graham found Yemi at the gate. He did not know, specifically, who she was. He knew she was the woman who had come to his row and managed the room around his wife while the doctor worked, who had held Carol's hand, who had said, in a voice that Carol had later described as the quietest, most certain thing she'd heard in a crisis, she's with us. We're watching. You don't have to hold this alone. He said, thank you. He meant the specific thing he was saying. Yemi said, the doctor did the work. You did something else. He said, I don't know what to call it, but you did it. She said, I hope you feel better soon. He said, I'm already better. Knowing what was in that room, knowing who was in it, I'm already better. She went to find Kweku, who was waiting with the canvas bag and Alexei's paper and the specific patience of an old mathematician who had somewhere to be and was not in a hurry to be there. They were going to Cambridge. He had an office. She had time before the appointment with Nadia. They were going to go through the paper properly. The whole thing. And then they were going to tint a cock about the next steps. And then she was going to go to Nadia's house and sit with Alexei's wife and tell her that her husband's last work had mattered. And that it had done the thing Alexei had spent 30 years of friendship hoping her work would do, which was to push past the edge of what chess could see, into the territory where chess needed mathematics to find the language. The sequence was published 14 months later, in the Journal of Combinatorics. It was co-authored, in the order they had agreed, Oduya, Mensah, and Petrov. The third name listed because the paper was built on his foundation, and because Nadia had said, when Yemi asked, he would have wanted to be on it. He worked for 8 months on those pages. Put him on it. The title was, On the Infinite Non-Periodic Structure of a Class of Chess Positions, the Oduya-Mensah-Petrov Sequence. The abstract contained a sentence that Kweku had written and Yemi had approved, and that was, as these things went, as accessible as a sentence in a mathematics abstract could be. We describe a class of chess positions that exhibit neither periodic repetition nor thermodynamic convergence, but a third behavior structured non-resolution, which we term the Oduya property, and which has implications for the theory of combinatorial games beyond chess. The chess world did what it did, which was to dispute it fiercely for 2 years and then to accept it, because the error that everyone looked for was not there. And the evidence for the thing that Alexei had first called times, structured non-resolution times, accumulated until it became impossible to argue with. Mama Titi's book went back into print. Yemi taught her class at the community center in Brixton, 2 days a week. 11-year-olds who did not yet know they were learning to see. She told them about the Queen. She told them that the Queen was not the most powerful piece because she could go anywhere. She was the most powerful piece because she saw everywhere. She told them, "You will use this everywhere. Every room you walk into, every person you sit across from, you will see the lines they are running. 3 moves ahead, and you will know what to do." She had the notebook with her when she taught. The 43rd one, the one with the sequence in it, the one with the coffee ring from Reykjavik and the smear from Tbilisi, and the variation she had avoided for 2 weeks, until an emergency at 31,000 feet had cleared her head, and she had come back to the tray table and seen the move. She was working on a new notebook. The 44th, she had a new problem. It was going to take longer than 11 years. She was not in a hurry. The work did not rush. The work revealed itself when it revealed itself. And you had to be present when it did. She was always present. She had been taught to be. There is one more thing to say, and it is about the 11 years. People who have not spent 11 years on a single problem do not understand what 11 years means. They think it means stubbornness. They think it means failure to move on. They think it means something pathological about the person's relationship with defeat. What 11 years means, for the person inside it, is this. Every morning for 11 years, Yemi had opened the notebook, a different notebook, but always the same sequence, evolving, and sat with it. Every morning she had come to it not with the expectation of solving it, but with the expectation of understanding it better, of asking it better questions, of building by small daily additions the structure of knowledge that would eventually be large enough that the answer had somewhere to land. She had not always made progress. There were stretches of months where the sequence gave her nothing, where she worked, and the problem remained as dense as it had been the month before. She had learned, in those stretches, to keep working anyway. Not because she believed she was making progress, she couldn't see, but because the relationship with a problem was itself the work, and the relationship required showing up. And showing up required believing that showing up mattered, even when the evidence for it was invisible. She had learned this from chess, from the specific lesson that Mama Titi had given her. At 9, sitting across the chessboard in the community center in Brixton, the Queen is not the most powerful piece because she can go anywhere. She is the most powerful piece because she sees everywhere. She had been told that this was a lesson about chess, and it was also a lesson about attention, about the specific quality of attention that made something possible that would not otherwise be possible, about the fact that the things you could not yet see were visible if you looked from the right place. And finding the right place was itself the work. 11 years of finding the right place. And then an airplane. A man in 2A who said a stray. A woman in 2B who said a smudge on the manifest. A flight attendant who believed her anyway. An emergency at row 14. A room to manage. The specific focus and release of 30 minutes of emergency. Coming back to the tray table. Seeing the move. It had not come from genius. Or not only from genius. It had come from 11 years. And from the clearing that emergency produced. And from Mama Titi's lesson. And from all the things that had been building since a 9-year-old sat across a chessboard and learned to see. She was 51 years old. She had 40 years of this behind her, and whatever was ahead, she was going to spend it the same way. Looking, seeing, 3 moves ahead. Always 3 moves ahead. Bernard Achebe. The civil engineer from 3A went home to his wife and told her he had sat behind Yemi Oduya on a plane. His wife, whose name was Margaret, who had taught herself chess 15 years ago from a book, who played at the community club every Tuesday, who had a specific and lifelong relationship with the game that she had never been able to explain to Bernard in terms he fully understood, looked at him for a long moment and said, "You sat behind Yemi Oduya." "Yes." "What did she say?" She said, when you're close to the answer, you're afraid to look at the variation that has it in it." He paused. She was talking about chess, but she said it like it was a general principle. Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "That's true." "About chess?" "About everything." Margaret said, "There's always a line of play you keep avoiding, because you know what's in it. Even when you don't know yet, your body knows before your mind catches up." She looked at him. Did she find it? The thing she was working on? "I think so," he said. She had a look, like someone who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just seen it. Margaret said, "Good." She said it the way she said things that mattered to her simply, without elaboration, the word carrying the full weight. She meant good. Someone had found the thing they were looking for. That was worth saying good about. Bernard sat down and thought about the load case he kept not running. The one on the bridge his firm was designing. The one that his instinct had been telling him for months to look at, and that he had been finding reasons not to. He thought about what the woman on the plane had said. "Times the variations I keep avoiding are usually the ones with the answer in them." Times, and he thought about the bridge. The next morning he ran the load case. It told him something he needed to know. It was not catastrophic, but it was a correction, a change he needed to make. A load path he had been routing around without knowing why. That needed to be rerouted. He made the change. He noted, in his project log, load, case 14. November 2024. Ran after conversation with chess player on flight. The bridge was built the year after. It carried its load. The load path was correct. These were small things. The bridge was not famous. The load case was not the thing that made the bridge notable. But the bridge stood. And the bridge was correct. And the correctness was in the load path. And the load path was correct because a man on an airplane had talked to a woman who was doing a hard thing with patience and had come home and thought about the hard thing he was avoiding. The world moved this way. It moved in these small connections, in the specific friction of people who were paying attention, rubbing against each other and producing, in the rubbing, a little light. Sienna. The flight attendant who had gone to get Yemi told the story of the flight at her crew briefing the following week. Not the chess part. She didn't know the chess part yet. She told the version she had. A passenger came on the flight. Was treated badly at the door. Sat down without a fuss. And when someone needed help 6 rows back, she was already standing. She managed the room. She was calm. She was the thing the situation needed. The senior flight attendant listened and said, "What made you go to her?" Sienna said, I knew she'd know what to do." "How?" "I don't know," she said. She just seemed like someone who'd been in the situation before. Not a medical situation. A situation. She just seemed like someone who knew how situations worked. The senior flight attendant nodded. She said, "Trust that. Whatever that is, that reading of a person, trust it. It's a skill. It takes time to develop. But when it tells you something, trust it." Sienna trusted it. She had been trusting it since the boarding. Since the moment she had looked at a woman being told she didn't belong and had thought, "That's someone who's been here before." She did not know. Then, what she was trusting. She was learning to trust it anyway. This was in the way of these things. Also a thing Mama Titi would have recognized. The seeing that went before the knowing. The queen who saw everywhere. The skill could be learned. It just took time. The last thing to say is about the wooden box. Mama Titi had carried the chess set from Lagos in 1963 in a wooden box with a broken latch. The box had made it to Brixton and had lived on a shelf in the community center for 30 years, and had then, when the community center closed, come to Yemi, who had put it on a shelf in her study in London and had not opened it for a long time. After the paper was published, after the Oduya Mensa Petrov sequence had been named and debated and accepted and had taken its place in the literature, Yemi opened the box. She had not opened it since Mama Titi died. She had not been ready. She was ready now. Inside, the chess pieces. Ivory and ebony, worn smooth by 50 years of use. The pawns first, which was how Mama Titi had always packed them, the pawns first. The major pieces last. The king and queen at the very bottom. She lifted them out one by one and set them on her desk. The queen was last. She picked it up. Ivory. Smooth. The crown worn to a suggestion. She held it in her palm. The specific weight of it. The weight she had known since she was 9 years old. The queen is not the most powerful piece because she can go anywhere. She is the most powerful piece because she sees everywhere. She set the queen on the desk. She opened the 44th notebook. She found the first blank page. She wrote, at the top, the beginning of the new problem, not the answer, not the question, just the beginning. The specific first notation that said, here is where we start. She looked at the queen. All right, Mama, she said. She got to work. There is, in the Journal of Combinatorics, a footnote at the bottom of page 7 of the Oduya Mensa Petrov paper. It is the kind of footnote that almost no one reads, because almost no one reads footnotes in mathematics papers, except the people who are looking for the specific thing the footnote contains. But it is there. And it says, the authors wish to acknowledge the contribution of Petrov 2022, presented posthumously and in full in the appendix. We also wish to acknowledge the specific conditions under which the central insight of this paper was developed. Flight BA 207, November 2024, somewhere above the North Atlantic. The position which had resisted 11 years of analysis became clear during the 12 minutes following a passenger medical emergency. The authors do not recommend medical emergencies as a heuristic for mathematical breakthrough. We observe, however, that the specific quality of focus and release produced by a crisis managed and resolved can empty the mind in ways that 11 years of sustained effort sometimes cannot. Oduya, in conversation with Mensa during the flight, described it as follows. When you've been holding a position for a long time, and then you have to let it go, when something outside the problem forces you out of the problem, you come back to it, seeing the piece you weren't seeing. The authors commend this observation to anyone working on a hard problem. She had written the footnote herself. Kweku had read it and said, "It's unusual for a mathematics paper." She said, "The unusual thing happened." He said, "You're going to get letters." "I get letters," she said. She got letters from mathematicians, from chess players, from people working on things that had resisted them for years, who had read the footnote and recognized something in it. She answered the letters she could answer, and filed the ones she could not, and kept working on the 44th notebook. The letters she filed were in a folder. The folder was getting thick. She did not think of herself as someone who received letters worth keeping. She thought of herself as someone who had a sequence to work on, and a class to teach, and a wooden box on a shelf with an ivory queen in it. She was right about all of these things. She was also, and this was the part she would have deflected if someone had said it to her directly, the first person to see something that had not been seen before, to sit with a problem for 11 years and then come back from a stranger's emergency to a tray table on an airplane and find, in the variation she had been avoiding for 2 weeks, the answer that changed the way people thought about a game that a woman named Mama Titi had carried from Lagos in a box with a broken latch in 1963. She was that. She would keep working on the next one. She would keep teaching the 11-year-olds in Brixton. She would keep going to the community center twice a week and sitting across the board from children who did not yet know they were learning to see. She would tell them, the queen is not the most powerful piece because she can go anywhere. She is the most powerful piece because she sees everywhere. You will use this everywhere. Every room you walk into, every person you sit across from, every position that has resisted you, you will see the lines. 3 moves ahead, and you will know what to do. And when you do not know, when the position is harder than knowing, when you need 11 years and a flight over the Atlantic and a medical emergency and an old mathematician with a dead friend's paper in a canvas bag, you will keep showing up. You will keep showing up. Because the position is always solvable, you just have to stay long enough to see the move. She had stayed. She had seen it. She was going to keep going. She was always going to keep going. That was the whole thing. That was everything. That was enough. The community center in Brixton is not the same building as the original. The original was demolished in 1998, replaced with a car park that was itself replaced. Eventually, with something mixed use that no one finds especially distinguished. The new community center is 3 blocks away. A converted warehouse with high ceilings and good light, and a room on the 2nd floor where chess is taught twice a week by a woman who has been the #1 ranked player in the world for the majority of the last 20 years, who asks for nothing in exchange for her Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The children who come to the class are 11. Mostly. Some are younger. A few are older. They come from the neighborhood, which is a neighborhood of many people and many histories, and the specific compressed energy of a place that has been through a great deal and has remained through all of it itself. They come because a parent signed them up, usually, or because a friend told them it was good, or because they had the particular pull toward the game that some people felt and could not explain. She teaches them the same things Mama Titi taught her. Not the moves first, the moves could wait. The moves were not the point. She teaches them first to see the whole board, to sit with the position, to resist the first impulse, the impulse to take the piece that could be taken, to make the move that presented itself, and to look instead at what the position was asking. She teaches them the queen is not the most powerful piece because she can go anywhere. She is the most powerful piece because she sees everywhere. She teaches them the variations you avoid are usually the ones with the answer in them. She teaches them a hard position is not a broken position. It is a position that is teaching you something you are not yet ready to learn. You have to stay long enough to be ready. Some of them become chess players. Some of them do not. She does not consider the ones who do not a failure. She considers them people who learn to see, and who will use the seeing in whatever room they find themselves in. And that is enough. That has always been enough. That was what Mama Titi was doing in a community center in Brixton in 1983, with a wooden box and a girl who would not stop losing. She was not making chess players. She was making people who could see Yemi Oduya. 51 years old, five-time world chess champion, author of the Oduya Mensa Petrov sequence. The woman from Flight 207, who managed the room at row 14 and came back to a tray table above the Atlantic and found the move is making people who can see. She is in the room right now, probably. There is a board in front of her and a child across from her, and she is watching the child see. And she is quiet, because the seeing is the child's work, and you cannot do it for them. You can only teach them that it is possible, that it has always been possible, that the board has always had the answer in it, and the answer has always been available to the person who is willing to stay long enough to see. She stayed. She saw. She is here. She is always going to be here. That is the whole of it. He didn't run. He walked. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his chin tucked into the high collar of his coat against the damp river wind, his boots making a flat. Dry times, clack, clack, clack times on the wet stone of the embankment. The man 50 yards behind him, 32 years old, built like a sack of wet flour, wearing a leather jacket that smelled of stale tobacco and cheap oil, was running. Not fast, the heavy, desperate trot of a man who had already spent his first wind on the stairs at the dock and was now running on pure, sour panic. Yemi did not look back. He didn't need to look back. He had played the position out 3 moves ago, while they were still standing under the yellow arc lamp by the grain silo. Move 1. The man in the leather jacket, his name was Vance, though Yemi had not asked for it, would realize that the envelope in his inner pocket was not the manifest for the 6 o'clock barge. He would realize it right about the time his fingers touched the edge of the index cards Yemi had tucked inside to give it weight. Move 2. Vance would reach for the small nickel-plated revolver he kept in his right waistband. Forget that the latch on his jacket was snagged, and spend 4 seconds tearing at his own zipper while Yemi stepped into the shadow of the crane. Move 3. Vance would run into the open, expecting Yemi to be heading for the footbridge, and would instead find himself 30 paces behind a man who was walking at an unhurried, rhythmic 4 miles an hour toward the night market on High Street. "Hey!" Vance's voice came across the wet stone, thin and ragged. "Hey, you, old man." Yemi stopped. He didn't turn his body. He simply shifted his weight onto his left heel and looked back over his shoulder. The street lamp above them was flickering. A high, rhythmic hum that sounded like a hornet trapped in a jar. "You're out of breath." "Mr. Vance," Yemi said. His voice was low, clipped with the dry, precise vowels of a South London classroom 40 years behind him. That's a poor baseline for a conversation. Vance hit the curb, skidded 2 inches on the slick mud, and caught himself against the iron railing. His face was the color of a turnip that had spent the winter in a dark cellar. The paper. He gasped. His hand, flat against his ribs. That ain't the manifest. Those are recipe cards. System cards. Yemi corrected gently. 5 by 3. Very useful for cataloging positional variations. I find the grid lines help with the notation. You took the manifest. I took the manifest 11 minutes ago, Yemi said. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, navy blue composition notebook with worn cardboard corners, and tucked a folded sheet of yellowed onion skin paper behind the elastic band at the back. While you were explaining to me how much your uncle paid for his motorboat. A tedious story. Vance, you overemphasize the horsepower. Men who actually own fast boats rarely discuss the displacement. Vance's right hand twitched toward his belt. Yemi took one step forward. Just one. His posture didn't change. His shoulders remained loose under the heavy wool of his overcoat. His chin level, but the angle of his head shifted 3 degrees to the left. His eyes locking onto the small, dark grease stain on the lapel of Vance's jacket. "If you pull that out," Yemi said, "you have to use it. If you use it," the constable at the corner of Dock and Miller, who is currently 300 yards away, drinking tea out of a tin mug behind the coal scales, will be here in 2 minutes. He is 19 years old and very nervous. He will shoot you in the thigh because his hands shake when he's startled. Then I will have to sit on a cold bench in the station until 4 in the morning, explaining why a man with 3 convictions for receiving stolen lead was found bleeding on the embankment with an empty gun. Vance froze. His hand stayed buried under the leather flap. "How do you know about the constable?" "He's been there since 8. Yemi said. "He changes his feet every 7 minutes because his boots are too small. I heard him shift his weight 4 times while we were talking by the silo." Yemi turned back toward High Street. "The position is closed." "Vance," he said over his shoulder, "go home. Put some lard on that zipper before it ruins another coat." The night market didn't smell like the river. The river smelled of iron, salt, and the cold, dead mud that collected under the piers at low tide. The market smelled of chicory, hot fat, fried onions, and the damp wool of 300 people standing too close together under canvas awnings that dripped dirty rainwater onto their hats. Yemi liked the market. It was a crowd, but it wasn't a mob. A mob had a single, stupid mind that moved like a dog on a chain. A market was 200 individual calculations happening at once. The butcher weighing the brisket against the weight of his thumb. The woman with the cabbage cart deciding whether to drop her price by a halfpenny before the fog turned the leaves gray. The boy with the tray of meat pies watching the constable's helmet over the top of the tea stall. It was geometry. Simple. Fluid geometry. He stopped at the stall under the green lamp, the one that smelled of scorched cedar and tallow. "Doctor," the man behind the board said. He was 60, broad-shouldered, with the short, thick fingers of a cooper and an apron that had been washed until the linen was as thin as greaseproof paper. His name was Miller. "Mr. Miller," Yemi said. "He's late." "He isn't late," Yemi said, checking the small silver pocket watch he kept in his waistcoat. "It's 7 minutes to 9. He said 9. He's late for a man who wants what you've got. Men who want what I have are always late," Yemi said, setting his notebook on the dry corner of the crate where Miller kept his spare pegs. "It's a form of negotiation. If they arrive 5 minutes early, they look eager. If they arrive 5 minutes late, they think it makes them look busy. It's the standard play of an amateur who has read 1 book on management and understood half of it." Miller grunted. He reached under the trestle, pulled out 2 small wooden pieces, a knight carved from boxwood, its mane worn flat by 50 years of thumbs, and a black pawn with a chipped collar, and set them on the grain of the oak crate. The boy from the dock came by. Miller said, "Vance?" "The other one." "The one with the bad ear." "Ah, little Arthur." Yemi didn't touch the pieces. He looked at the boxwood knight. "What did Arthur want?" "He wanted to know if you were still living over the Bakers." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him you'd moved to Leeds," Miller said, 3 years ago, and that you died there of the quinsy." Yemi's mouth twitched. "Leeds is a bit dramatic." "Miller, a man doesn't go to Leeds unless he's fleeing a debt or a wife." He believed it. Miller said. He gave me a copper to put flowers on your grave if I ever went north. Keep the copper, Yemi said. Use it for the salt. A shadow fell across the crate. Not the broad, slow shadow of a porter or the sharp, nervous shadow of a street runner. Tall, thin shadow that smelled of lavender water and expensive, dry-cleaned wool. Doctor, Oduya? Yemi didn't look up immediately. He reached out, picked up the boxwood knight, turned it once, between his middle finger and his thumb, and set it down on the square where the pawn had been. You're 4 minutes early. Mr. Crane, Yemi said. That suggests either an unexpected gap in your evening or a sudden lack of confidence in your position. Philip Crane, 34, impeccably shaved, with the kind of narrow, gray eyes that looked as if they had been designed specifically to find fault with invoice ledgers, stepped under the canvas. He was wearing an overcoat with a velvet collar that had never seen a drop of river fog in its life. I don't like markets, Crane said. He looked at the wooden pieces on the crate with the mild disgust of a man who had been asked to inspect a drain. They're noisy, and the light is bad. The light is adequate for counting, Yemi said. He opened the blue notebook, reached behind the elastic band, and pulled out the yellowed sheet of onion skin paper he had taken from Vance 20 minutes before. The manifest for the Times, Mary Rose, October 1884. The month your grandfather claimed the timber cargo was lost at sea off the Goodwin Sands. Crane's hand went out. It was a fast hand, trained to grab deeds and stock certificates off Green Bay's tables before the ink was dry. Yemi's hand didn't move to cover the paper. He simply laid his forefinger across the top margin, where the dockmaster's red ink stamp was still legible despite the salt stain. The insurance was paid in full, Yemi said, his voice flat. Neutral, like a clerk reading the weather report. £4,000. Paid to Crane and Sons, timber merchants, Borough High Street. A very tidy sum for 1884. Enough to buy the lease on the yard at Rotherhithe. My grandfather. Your grandfather was a thief. Mr. Crane, Yemi said. A very organized thief, which is the only kind that ever accumulates enough capital to send his grandson to Harrow, but a thief nonetheless. That paper is 60 years old, Crane hissed, his face darkening under the yellow light of the cedar lamp. It has no legal standing in a court of equity. A court of equity? No, Yemi agreed. The board of the Surrey Commercial Dock Company, however, has a very strict clause regarding the historical validity of timber leases. If this manifest is presented at their annual meeting on Thursday, the lease on the Rotherhithe yard, the one your firm currently has up for auction to the railway company, becomes void under the 1862 Act. Crane took a breath. His shoulders went rigid. Move 1. He would offer £50. Move 2. Yemi would refuse it. Not because it was too little, but because an immediate refusal would force Crane to realize that money was not the currency being used. Move 3. Crane would look at the boxwood knight on the crate, understand for the first time in his life that he was not the player in the room, and ask the only question that mattered. How much do you want? Crane asked. Yemi closed the notebook with a small, dry thwack. I don't want your money. Mr. Crane, Yemi said. He slid the yellow paper back behind the elastic band. I want the key to the cellar under the old cooperage on Staint. Olaves Lane. Crane stared at him. The cooperage? That building has been derelict since the cholera year. There's nothing in there except rot and dead rats. Then giving me the key will cost you nothing, Yemi said, and the Rotherhithe auction can proceed on Thursday without any historical interruptions. Crane reached into his waistcoat. He pulled out a small, heavy iron key with a square bow, attached to a brass ring that had turned green at the edges. He set it on the crate beside the boxwood knight. "Why?" Crane asked, his voice dropping into a genuine, unscripted curiosity for the first time since he had stepped under the awning. "What is in St. Olave's?" Yemi picked up the key. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of old iron and damp cellar earth. "A decision," Yemi said, made in 1891 by a man who thought he had 6 moves left when he only had 1. He stood up, tucked the blue notebook under his arm, and nodded to Miller. "Doctor," Miller said, not looking up from his pegs, "the rain's coming back." "It's already here." "Miller," Yemi said, stepping out from under the green lamp into the gray. "Cold drizzle of High Street. It just hasn't hit the pavement yet." Stained. Olave's Lane was 3 streets back from the river, narrow as a coffin's lid and choked with the wet smell of dead hops from the brewery at the corner. The cooperage door was oak, 6 inches thick, reinforced with diagonal iron straps that had rusted into thick, orange scales. The square key went into the lock with a dry, screeching protest, like a nail being pulled from seasoned ash. But the bolt threw with a heavy times clunk times that vibrated through the wood into Yemi's palm. He didn't open the door wide, just enough to slide his shoulders through. The air inside was old. Not bad, not the sharp. Sour rot of stagnant water, or the sweet. Heavy stench of dead meat, but dry. Cold. And still, like the air inside an unsealed vault. He pulled a small brass bullseye lantern from his pocket, struck a match against the dry sole of his boot, and touched the blue flame to the wick. The yellow circle of light cut through the dark, reflecting off the fine, gray dust that lay like fur over the stone steps leading down. At the bottom of the steps, the cellar opened into a low, vaulted room, supported by 4 brick pillars. In the center of the room sat a table. Not a Cooper's table, a trestle table of dark, unpolished walnut, 6 feet long. Its surface ruled into 64 alternating squares of ebony and Hollywood inlay. On the table sat a board, not set up for play. The pieces were scattered across the squares in the middle of an unfinished endgame, a white king trapped in the corner behind 2 doubled pawns, a black rook standing on the 7th rank, and a single ivory queen standing alone on an empty diagonal, 6 squares away from everything else. Beside the board lay a soft cover notebook, navy blue, identical to the 42 Yemi had filled over 40 years. The cover was gray, with 60 years of dust. Yemi didn't touch the board. He walked to the edge of the table, set his lantern down on the unruled walnut, and looked at the position. White to move. He knew the position. He had known it since he was 9 years old, sitting in the basement of the community center in Brixton, while the rain drummed on the high, iron-grated windows, and Mama Titi turned her wooden teacup round and round in her hands. The line Petrov played in Vienna, he thought, the one he swore couldn't be resolved without a knight's sacrifice on C6. He reached out, his long, calloused fingers hovering 2 inches above the white king. Behind him, in the dark at the top of the stone steps, a door hinge creaked. It wasn't Crane. Crane didn't have the boots for these stairs, Crane's boots had thin leather soles that clicked like spoons on stone. These boots were heavy, metal-shod, and moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had spent 30 years walking high ledges. You took your time. Doctor, Olduya, a voice said from the shadows behind the third brick pillar. Yemi didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the Ivory Queen, standing on the empty diagonal. The manifest took 20 minutes longer than I estimated. Yemi said, Mr. Vance has a very poor zipper on his coat. It delayed his pursuit. A man stepped into the yellow ring of the lantern light. He was 70, short, with a broad, flat face that looked as though it had been carved out of salt pork and a thick gray mustache that covered his upper lip completely. He was wearing the dark blue uniform of a retired Thames River police inspector. The silver buttons polished until they looked like shillings stuck to his chest. His name was Inspector Hatcher. He's dead. Yemi, Hatcher said softly. Yemi's fingers stayed steady above the White King. When? Tuesday. In his sleep. At the home in Richmond, Hatcher took a heavy silver snuff box from his pocket, tapped the lid twice with his thumb, and put it back without opening it. He left you the box. The box is on the table. Hatcher. Not that box, Hatcher said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, square package wrapped in oilskin and tied with thick, tarred twine. The one from Lagos. The one his father brought back in '63. Yemi turned around then. The lantern light caught his face, the high, sharp cheekbones, the gray at his temples that looked like frost on iron, the dark, steady eyes that had spent 40 years looking 3 moves past the person standing in front of him. He didn't give it to Nadia? Yemi asked. Nadia died 3 months ago. Yemi, you'd have known that if you'd answered the letters. Yemi was silent for 3 breaths. The hum of the river, the deep, low vibration of the tide turning under the stone piers 3 streets away, came through the brickwork like a pulse. I was working, Yemi said. You're always working, Hatcher said. He set the oilskin package on the edge of the walnut table, 6 inches from the cracked blue notebook. Alexei spent his last 3 weeks asking for you, not about the chess, not about the sequence. He wanted to know if you'd ever found the line his father talked about, the one where the queen doesn't take. Yemi looked at the package. He didn't touch it. Tell me, Hatcher, Yemi said, his voice dropping into that low, flat register that sounded like stone, moving on stone. Why did you come here tonight? You're not a river inspector anymore. You don't carry the keys to Staint. Olaves. I came, Hatcher said, because Alexei made me swear on his mother's icon that I'd see you open that paper before the clock on St. Jude's struck 10. Yemi reached into his waistcoat, pulled out his silver pocket watch, and clicked the latch. 9:48. 12 minutes. He always was obsessed with the clock. Yemi murmured. He stepped around the trestle table, picked up the oilskin package, and cut the tarred twine with the small, curved thumb knife he used for trimming his pencil leads. The oilskin fell away. Inside was no chess set, no manuscript, no long-lost proof written in Alexei's dense, sprawling Russian hand. There was only a single photograph, yellowed at the edges and faded to the color of dry tea leaves, showing a 9-year-old girl sitting across a square of dark wood from an old woman whose face was a map of Brixton, rain, and Lagos sun. And behind the photograph, folded twice, a single sheet of paper with 4 lines written on it in Mama Titi's thick, purple ink. The queen does not take, because the queen does not need the piece. She takes the space the piece was standing in. When you see the space, Yemi, stop looking at the board. Look at the room. Yemi stood very still in the yellow circle of the bullseye lantern. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady, hard downpour that rattled against the high iron grating at the top of the cellar wall like a handful of small pebbles tossed against a window. "Well?" Hatcher asked from the dark by the pillar. "Is it the line?" Yemi looked up from the paper. He looked at the white king trapped in the corner. He looked at the black rook on the 7th rank. He looked at the ivory queen, standing alone on the empty diagonal. Then he reached out, took the white king between his thumb and forefinger, and set it down not on the board, but off the wood entirely, on the dark walnut of the trestle table, 3 inches past the edge of the 64 squares. "No," Yemi said softly. "It isn't a line." "Hatcher." "What is it?" Then, Yemi picked up his lantern, blew out the wick, and let the cellar go completely black. "It's the end of the game," he said in the dark. "Now come along. We have 11 minutes to get to High Street before the tea stall closes. And my feet are cold. Take your grease-stained hands off my project plans. You're a glorified track sweeper in a cheap blue jacket. The kind of institutional deadweight this transit authority hires when nobody with actual talent applies. And I will not have my flagship launching delayed by a man who looks like he sleeps in the tool shed. Mr. Thorne, I'm the chief dispatcher and lead structural inspector for this terminal. I'm telling you that Trestle Bridge 4 has a 3mm thermal expansion shift under this rising river. And until that switch relay is manually verified, the Silver Line Express does not leave this platform. I have 200 investors, 3 city council members, and a camera crew sitting in first class. Raymond, I don't care if the bridge is shivering in its sleep. I spent $40 million building this private rail extension, and I am not having my press debut derailed by an over-promoted mechanic playing captain of safety. You spent $40 million on the coaches? Mr. Thorne, the river spent 10,000 years carving that gorge. The river doesn't care about your press release, and neither do I. That train stays put. I will have the board terminate your pension before the storm clears tonight. Men like you are replaceable by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Someone who actually understands modern business will sit at that desk. And you'll be back on the street sweeping gravel where you belong. Raymond Ray Vance did not raise his voice. 22 years in the dispatch tower of Central Terminal had taught him that raising his voice against a furious, wealthy man accomplished nothing except wasting oxygen he needed for thinking. He kept his hands flat against the iron edge of the master control desk, his shoulders loose beneath his dark blue wool uniform coat. His voice level the same, steady. Low register he used at 3 in the morning when his 10-year-old daughter Maya woke up from a nightmare about her late mother and needed someone solid standing in the doorway. Not someone who matched her fear with his own. Mr. Thorne, you can call the board. You can call the mayor. Or you can stand here and yell until your throat goes dry. But as long as my signature is required on the line clearance log, that switch stays locked red. Now, if you'll step back from my console, I have a storm protocol to monitor. Julian Thorne, 52 years old, founder of Thorne Private Rail, wearing a bespoke cashmere overcoat that cost more than Ray's monthly mortgage payment, glared at the dispatcher with the sharp, practiced contempt of a man who had spent 30 years buying his way past every rule that ever tried to slow him down. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive gin and peppermint, and spat out the words that sat behind Ray's ribs for the rest of the night. I'll be watching from the observation deck when they overrule you. And when they hand me your keys, I'm going to make sure your daughter knows her father got fired for being too stupid to hold a job. Ray looked at the angry man for 3 quiet seconds. He didn't reach for a retort. Instead, his right hand slipped into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around a small, heavy piece of cold brass, an old pocket track gauge given to him by his grandfather. A Pullman porter who had spent 40 years on the night runs between Chicago and Atlanta, the brass was worn smooth at the corners, the calibration marks almost erased by 80 years of thumbs. And on the back, scratched deep into the metal with the point of a pocket knife, were 13 words. The track doesn't care who built the engine. It only cares if the switches are set true. Ray touched the brass, turned it once in his palm, and said softly, "Watch all you like, Mr. Thorne. Just make sure you watch the bridge." To understand the cold brass gauge in Ray Vance's pocket, you have to understand the year that made him a single father before he had finished learning how to be a husband. 5 years ago. His wife Sarah, a middle school science teacher who could explain the life cycle of a monarch butterfly to a room of hyperactive 11-year-olds without ever raising her voice, had gone into the hospital for Sarah. What was supposed to be a routine gallbladder removal. A sudden, catastrophic surgical complication. The kind of 1 in a million medical tragedy that leaves doctors staring at floor tiles in quiet hallways. Took her in less than 2 hours. Ray had walked out of Carver Memorial Hospital at 4 a.m. into a freezing November rain, holding a 5-year-old girl who kept asking why Mom's car was still in the parking lot if Mom wasn't coming home. He had taken 3 weeks of leave, burned through every sick day he'd accumulated in 17 years, and sat on the floor of Maya's bedroom night after night while she slept, terrified by the sheer, crushing weight of being the only adult left in the house. He remembered, with a clarity that still made his throat tight. The first night, his mother had gone back to her own house after staying 3 weeks to help. He had stood in the kitchen at 2 a.m, holding a cup of cold instant coffee, looking at a stack of unpaid utility bills and a school permission slip that needed Sarah's signature. And he had felt a panic so pure and cold it felt like drowning in dry air. I can't do this alone, he had thought. I don't know how to raise a daughter without Sarah. I'm just a track guy. Then he had walked into the hallway, looked at the small frame drawing Maya had taped to his bedroom door, a picture of a blue train crossing a high bridge, with a tall man in a dark cap standing at the switch. Labeled in shaky pink crayon times, Daddy fixes the rails times, and he had forced his lungs to take a full, slow breath. He hadn't quit. He had bid on the graveyard dispatch, shift 11:00 p.m. to 7:00 a.m. because it paid an extra $4 an hour night differential. And because it meant he could be standing at the elementary school gate every single afternoon at 3:15 when Maya walked out the double doors. He slept in 4-hour stretches, 4 hours while Maya was at school, 2 hours after she went to bed, living in a permanent state of high-functioning exhaustion that left his eyes bloodshot and his knuckles raw, but made sure his daughter never once walked out of that school building to find an empty sidewalk. His grandfather's brass track gauge had sat on Sarah's nightstand during those long first months. Before every shift, Ray would pick it up, feel the worn weight of the metal, and read those 13 words. His grandfather, Edward Vance, had worked the rails in an era when black men weren't allowed inside the dispatch towers at all, men who had to check the switches by hand in knee-deep snow while the white engineers sat inside the warm cabs. Edward had passed the gauge to Ray on his 16th birthday, saying, "Ray, people are going to try to tell you that you don't belong in the high places. They're going to judge you by the color of your skin and the dirt on your boots. But the steel doesn't lie. A rail is either straight or it's warped. A switch is either locked or it's split. You master the steel, and nobody can ever take the truth away from you. Ray had mastered the steel. For 22 years, he knew every turnout, every expansion joint, every signal relay across 60 miles of urban trackage. He could tell you which rail on the High River trestle expanded 2 millimeters when the July sun hit it at noon, and which switch motor on the North Yard loop tended to freeze when the humidity dropped below 20%. And now, at midnight on a Tuesday, with an October gale howling down the river valley and 6 inches of rain turning the High River into a churning, timber-strewn torrent, Julian Thorne was standing in his dispatch tower, threatening his job because Ray refused to clear a luxury train across a bridge that was groaning under 30,000 tons of rising water. Inside the dispatch control room, the storm rattled the high, iron-framed windows like a fist trying to get in. Radar screens glowed green and amber across the main wall. On the primary track status board, Trestle Bridge 4 was flashing a yellow caution box, Sensor 4B, located at the midspan expansion joint, was reading a 2 millimeter lateral deflection. "Ray," said Leo Harris, a 24-year-old junior dispatcher sitting at the adjacent console. Leo was 6 months out of the transit academy, his tie still tied in a tight, nervous knot. His eyes wide as he looked back and forth between the flashing yellow box and the window. Board Chairman Whitlock is on line 2. He's calling from Thorne's office in the city. He says Thorne called him directly. Ray didn't touch the phone. "Tell Chairman Whitlock I'm in the middle of a storm protocol check. Tell him I'll call him back the second Trestle 4 reads green. Or the second the Silver Line is safely sidetracked to Yard C." "Ray." He sounded really angry. Leo whispered, his voice cracking slightly. He said Thorne is threatening to pull his private maintenance funding from the whole authority if we miss the launch window. Ray turned his head slowly toward the young man. "Leo, look at me." Leo looked up, his fingers trembling against his keyboard. "What is the first rule of the tower?" Ray asked. His voice was low, steady, devoid of panic. "Protect the line," Leo recited automatically. "And what is the second rule?" "The dispatcher owns the switch." "That's right," Ray said. "Not the board chairman, not the guy who bought the silk seats in first class. The dispatcher. Because if that train goes into the river, Chairman Whitlock isn't the one who has to look the conductor's widow in the eye. We own the switch. Leo, remember that when the phones start ringing." Before Leo could answer, the primary radio console squawked with static, followed by the crisp, urgent voice of engineer Frank Miller aboard the Silver Line Express, Central Dispatch. "This is Silver Line 1. We are holding at signal 42, 2 miles south of Trestle 4. We've got 212 passengers aboard. Mr. Thorne's daughter, Clara, just came up to the cab. She says her father told her we're being held because of a minor paperwork glitch. Ray, what's your read on the trestle?" Ray hit the key. "Silver Line 1. Central. We have a 3.2 millimeter lateral shift on the midspan joint at Trestle 4. River gauges show the water level is 18 inches above flood stage and rising. I have debris warnings from the upper valley submerged timber moving downstream. I am holding you at signal 42 until I have physical, visual verification of the locking pin on switch 12. There was a long pause over the radio. Then Miller's voice came back. "Lower this time? Copy that. Central. We hold at 42. But Ray." Thorne's daughter is 19 years old. She's sitting in coach with 40 high school students from the City Youth Orchestra who were invited for the maiden ride. They're right behind the engine. Ray's hand tightened on the microphone until his knuckles turned ash gray. 40 kids. 19-year-old girl. 200 passengers. Copy. Silver line 1, Ray said, his voice dropping into a quiet, absolute register. Hold your position. I am taking the track car out to Trestle 4 myself. Leo jumped out of his chair. Ray! You can't go out on the trestle in this! The wind gusts are hitting 50 miles an hour out there. Maintenance is supposed to handle visual checks. Maintenance is trapped on the North Loop because of a fallen oak tree, Ray said, grabbing his heavy yellow oilskin coat from the wall peg. It'll take them 45 minutes to clear the track. We don't have 45 minutes. The river's rising an inch every 10 minutes. He looked at Leo. His eyes locked onto the young man's face. You've got the board. Leo. Keep everything else in the yard sidetracked. Do not clear Signal 42 under any circumstances unless I give you the verbal code from the bridge. You understand? Leo swallowed hard, looked at the flashing yellow box on the screen, and then looked at Ray. I understand. Chief, I've got the board. Ray pulled his oilskin tight, clipped his heavy waterproof lantern to his belt, and reached into his inner pocket to feel the cold, heavy square of his grandfather's brass gauge. Protect the line. Leo, Ray said, and walked out into the storm. The High River Trestle was built in 1912, a towering structure of riveted black iron and massive creosote-soaked timber piers that spanned 400 yards of narrow, rocky gorge, 60 feet above the water. When Ray stepped off the small motorized inspection rail car at the south approach, the wind hit him like a physical blow. The rain wasn't falling, it was moving sideways, driven by 40-knot gales that whipped up the canyon, driving cold needle-like drops straight into his eyes. Below him, the high river was a roaring, black monster, white-capped waves crashing against the stone footings, throwing spray 60 feet into the air. Ray unclipped his safety tether, snapped it onto the steel guide cable running along the outer walkway, and began crawling out onto the bridge. The metal groaned under his boots. Every few seconds, the entire structure would shudder a deep, subsonic vibration that Ray felt through his knees. The feeling of thousands of tons of iron fighting against the sheer kinetic force of a river in flood. He reached the mid-span expansion joint after 3 minutes of brutal crawling. He shone his lantern down into the iron housing. His breath caught. A massive submerged log, a 60-foot Douglas fir washed downstream from a logging site 5 miles up, had wedged itself diagonally between the center pier and the lower diagonal brace of Switch 12. The tremendous pressure of the river pushing against the log was acting like a giant lever, forcing the alignment pin of Switch 12 3 inches out of its seating socket. The automated sensor hadn't malfunctioned. It had been underestimating the danger. The switch wasn't just misaligned. It was partially split. If the 90-ton Silver Line Express hit that switch at 40 miles an hour, the lead wheels of the locomotive would catch the gap, derail, and drag 200 passengers off the edge of the trestle into 60 feet of churning black water. Ray pulled his radio from his harness. Leo, do you copy? This is Ray at Trestle 4. Static screamed through the speaker, followed by Leo's broken, faint voice. Ray. Static. Board chairman. Thorne is in the tower. He's trying to... Static. Override the signal manually from the master board. Ray's blood turned to ice water. Leo! Tell him to stop! The switch is split! If he overrides the signal, the train will come through on a split switch. Ray, he's... Static. He pushed me away from the console. He's putting the key in the manual override. Ray didn't hesitate. He dropped the radio, reached for the heavy iron manual throw lever mounted to the bridge frame, and threw his full weight against it. The lever didn't move. The pressure of the trapped fur log against the lower brace was locking the mechanism. The iron throw rod was jammed solid by the sheer weight of the river pushing against the tree. Ray looked down into the dark, churning canyon. The log was wedged 10 feet below the walkway, vibrating violently under the impact of the current. If he could release the mechanical lock pin on the manual override housing, he could force the switch to lock into the main line position. But it required 200 pounds of direct physical pressure applied directly to the iron dog lever while standing on the narrow, rain-slicked steel girder directly above the water. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his grandfather's brass gauge. He didn't use it as a tool. He held it in his left palm, pressing his thumb hard into the worn, familiar metal, letting the weight of it anchor him to the narrow beam. The track doesn't care who built the engine, he whispered into the roaring wind. It only cares if the switches are set true. He shoved the gauge back into his pocket, grabbed his 6-foot iron pry bar from the railcar kit, and stepped off the walkway onto the open girder. The wind screamed down the gorge, ripping the yellow hood off his head, drenching his hair and face in freezing river spray. 60 feet below, the black water churned like a cauldron of liquid iron. Ray wedged the tip of the iron pry bar between the jammed locking pin and the steel housing frame. He set his boots against the slippery rivets of the main girder, bent his knees, and pulled. Nothing moved. His muscles burned. The skin on his palms tore through his wet work gloves, leaving dark smears of blood on the iron handle. In the distance, 2 miles south, a long, deep air horn echoed through the storm. Foo, whoa, whoa. Thorne had done it. He had overridden the tower signal from the master console. Through the rain, Ray saw the bright, piercing white beam of the Silver Line Express's headlight round the curve at signal 42. The train was accelerating, moving at 50 miles an hour, rushing straight toward the High River trestle. Not tonight. Ray snarled into the gale. Not on my track! He threw his entire body weight backward, putting every ounce of his 48 years of living, every memory of Sarah's hospital room, every quiet afternoon walking Maya home from school, every drop of blood in his veins into the iron bar. Crack. The jammed locking pin sheared. The steel dog lever snapped forward with the force of a springboard, striking Ray hard in the chest, knocking him backward off the girder. For one terrifying second, Ray was airborne above the black gorge. His safety tether snapped taut with a brutal, bone-jarring times yank. He slammed hard against the outer iron frame of the bridge, the air exploding from his lungs in a red haze of pain. He hung there, dangling 60 feet above the river, spinning slowly in the darkness as the safety harness dug into his ribs. Above him, the heavy iron switch points slammed home into the mainline stock rail with a deep, metallic malclang-cunk. The safety pin dropped into place. The switch was locked true. 2 seconds later, the earth shook. The Silver Line Express hit the trestle at 55 miles an hour. The iron bridge screamed as 90 tons of rushing steel thundered overhead, the massive wheels pounding across the newly locked switch points with a rhythmic, deafening roar. Clack, 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 clack. Ray dangled in the dark beneath the bridge, the wind whipping his face, watching the illuminated windows of the passenger coaches flash past 30 feet above him like a string of golden beads. In the fourth coach, through the rain-streaked glass, he saw the pale, young face of a girl holding a violin case against her knee, completely unaware that 2 seconds earlier, 6 inches of rusted iron had stood between her and the bottom of the high river. The train thundered across the bridge, cleared the north approach, and smoothly glided onto the solid rock ballast of the main line, its red taillights fading safely into the dark toward Central Station. Ray hung in his harness, his lungs burning, his torn hands dripping blood into the river below, and let out a long, shuddering breath that turned to steam in the freezing air. Slowly, methodically, pulling himself up inch by inch along the nylon webbing of his safety line, the track dispatcher climbed back onto his bridge. When the motorized inspection car coasted back into the Central Terminal train shed 20 minutes later, the main platform was a chaos of flashing red lights, television camera crews, and shouting city officials. The Silver Line Express was parked safely at Track 1, its stainless steel coaches gleaming under the high arc lamps. A crowd of passengers was pouring off the train, greeted by relieved family members, city reporters, and transit officials who had rushed to the terminal when news of the signal override broke. Ray stepped off the track car. His yellow oilskin coat was torn at the shoulder. His face was smeared with black grease and river mud, and his right hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked shop towel he'd pulled from his toolkit. He walked past the television cameras, past the reporters shouting into microphones, heading straight for the stairs leading up to the tower. "Ray!" A voice called out from the crowd near the first-class lounge. Ray stopped. Julian Thorne was walking toward him across the wet concrete platform. Behind Thorne walked his 19-year-old daughter, Clara, wrapped in a dry woolen blanket, holding her violin case in her left hand. Standing next to them was Leo Harris, his face pale, his uniform tie undone, accompanied by 2 transit police officers. Thorne looked entirely different than he had 2 hours ago in the tower. His bespoke cashmere coat was soaked through at the shoulders. His face was gray, his eyes wide and hollowed out by a terror that no amount of money could buy protection from. "Ray," Thorne said. His voice was barely a rasp. "Leo. Leo told me what happened on the bridge. He showed me the telemetry data from the switch housing after the train cleared." Ray didn't say anything. He stood there in his torn coat, his boots caked in river mud, his bleeding hand held flat against his side. Thorne stopped 3 feet from Ray. He looked at the blood on Ray's hand, then at the grease on his face, and then down at the wet concrete platform. "I put the manual override key in the board," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling so violently his teeth clicked. I thought you were just playing politics. I thought you were trying to humiliate me in front of the press. I didn't know. I didn't know Clara had taken the early coach with the youth orchestra. I didn't know she was on the train." He looked up at Ray, his eyes wet, his mouth working around words that wouldn't come. "If you hadn't been out on that bridge," Thorne said, his voice breaking completely, "if you hadn't held that lever with your own hands, my daughter would be at the bottom of the high river right now. Because of me. Because I wouldn't listen to a man in a blue coat." Clara Thorne stepped forward from behind her father. She looked at Ray's face, then down at his blood-soaked shop towel, her eyes dark with a quiet, profound realization. "You're the dispatcher," she said softly. "The one my father called a track sweeper." Ray looked at the girl. She had Sarah's eyes, that same deep, steady brown that looked at a person without flinching. "I'm the dispatcher," Ray said gently. "My name is Ray." Clara reached out from under her blanket, took Ray's uninjured left hand in both of hers, and pressed it against her cheek. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The wet heat of her skin against his cold, calloused fingers said everything that 17 years of living had taught her about what just happened on the river. Thorne reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out his fine leather wallet. His hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it on the platform. He opened it, his fingers fumbling with a stack of $100 bills. "Ray. Please." Thorne gasped, trying to shove the money into Ray's torn coat pocket. "Please. Take this. Take whatever you want. I'll buy you a house. I'll set up a trust for your daughter. I'll make sure you never have to work a night shift again for the rest of your life. Just please tell me what I can give you." Ray looked at the stack of green paper in the rich man's trembling hand. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, the bone deep. Quiet tiredness of a man who has spent 22 years watching the world measure everything by the wrong yardstick. Slowly, carefully, Ray reached into his inner coat pocket with his left hand. He pulled out the small, square piece of cold brass. He didn't hand it to Thorne. He held it in his open palm between them under the bright glare of the terminal arc lamps, letting the yellow light catch the worn edges and the hand-carved letters on the back. "My grandfather gave me this when I was 16 years old." "Mr. Thorne," Ray said. His voice was low, clear, and carried across the quiet platform like a bell struck in an empty church. He was a Pullman porter. He spent 40 years cleaning up after men who wouldn't look him in the eye when they handed him their bags. He taught me that money can buy a train, and money can buy a platform, and money can buy a news crew to take your picture while you stand on it. Ray stepped one pace closer to Thorne. His eyes locked onto the wealthy man's pale, trembling face. "But money can't turn a split switch true," Ray said, "and money can't hold an iron bar against a rising river when the storm comes down the gorge. The steel doesn't care about your $40 million, Mr. Thorne. It only cares if the man holding the switch knows what he's doing, and cares enough about the people in the coaches to stay on the bridge when everybody else has gone home." Ray took his grandfather's gauge, tucked it carefully back into his coat pocket over his heart, and looked down at the $100 bills still clutching in Thorne's hand. "Keep your money. Mr. Thorne," Ray said softly. "Use it to hire a better contractor for Trestle 4. And the next time you see a man in a blue coat walking your track, take your hat off." Ray turned his back on the rich man, on the television cameras, and on the crowd of reporters, and walked toward the tower stairs. The internal investigation took 3 days. It was neither long nor complicated. Leo Harris's tower logs, combined with the automatic telemetry recordings from Trestle Bridge 4 and the radio transcripts from Signal 42, laid out the events of Tuesday night in undeniable, ironclad detail. Julian Thorne's private rail license was suspended indefinitely by the State Transit Commission for unauthorized override of a primary safety system. His firm was ordered to pay a $2 million fine to the City Transit Authority for structural negligence on Trestle 4. Funds that were immediately earmarked by the City Council for long overdue safety upgrades across the entire regional rail network. Thorne didn't fight the ruling. He didn't issue a press statement. According to terminal staff, he sold his private luxury coaches to a regional commuter line the following week, resigned from his corporate boards, and retired to his estate upriver, where he remained quietly out of the public eye. On Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the storm, Ray walked out the double glass doors of Central Terminal at 3 o'clock into a bright, crisp November afternoon. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was wearing his regular brown suede jacket. His hands healed, now, marked only by 2 faint pink scars across his right palm, where the iron bar had torn his skin. He walked 3 blocks down 9th Street to the gates of Carver Elementary School. The sidewalk was crowded with parents, mothers in heavy winter coats, fathers checking their wristwatches, grandmothers holding small, colorful umbrellas against the mild autumn chill. Ray stood near the iron fence by the oak tree, his hands in his pockets, feeling the cool autumn sun on his face. At Trey, Cinches Prezic. The heavy green double doors of the school swung open, and a wave of shouting, laughing children poured out onto the brick walkway. Among them, wearing her bright yellow raincoat and carrying a backpack shaped like a blue locomotive, was 10-year-old Maya. She spotted him instantly by the oak tree, her face lit up with that pure, fierce, unguarded joy that Ray lived his entire life to see. "Daddy!" She ran across the brick courtyard, her yellow coat flapping behind her, and threw her arms around his waist so hard he had to take a step back to catch his balance. Ray crouched down in the leaves, wrapped his arms around his daughter, and buried his face in her soft, dark hair, smelling the sweet, simple scent of school paste, rain, and fresh apples. "Hey, baby girl," Ray whispered, kissing her forehead. "How was the afternoon?" Maya pulled back, her dark brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, searching his face with that intense, serious scrutiny she brought to everything that mattered. "Leo came to our class today for career day," she said, her voice full of important news. "He wore his dispatcher cap. He told everybody about the storm on Trestle 4. Ray smiled faintly, smoothing her collar. "Did he?" "He said a man saved a whole train full of kids with an iron bar," Maya said, her eyes wide as she held up her hands to show the size of it. "He said the man was the bravest dispatcher in the whole state. He didn't say your name, but I knew. I told the girl next to me that the man was my dad." Ray looked at his daughter for a long moment, the afternoon sun catching the golden leaves falling around them in the quiet courtyard. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his grandfather's cold brass gauge, and set it gently in Maya's small, warm palm. "Your great-grandfather gave me this when I was 16. Maya," Ray said softly. "He told me that no matter how loud the world gets, and no matter how many people try to tell you you don't belong, if you hold the truth and do the work, the line will always stay clear." Maya turned the heavy brass over in her hands, her thumb tracing the worn, hand-carved letters on the back that she had learned to read 2 years ago. "The track doesn't care who built the engine," she read out loud, her voice clear and sweet in the autumn air. "It only cares if the switches are set true." She looked up at her father, her face solemn, and then slipped the cold brass gauge carefully into the front pocket of her yellow raincoat. "Can we go get hot chocolate now?" "Daddy?" she asked, taking his left hand in hers. "The kind with the extra marshmallows?" "We can get whatever kind you want, baby," Ray said. He stood up, took his daughter's small hand in his scarred left palm, and walked with her down the sunlit sidewalk toward 9th Street, leaving the dispatch tower, the iron bridges, and the roaring rivers behind him, right where they belonged, safe, clear, and quiet in the afternoon light. Cruelty in this world is rarely an explosion. It is the quiet, daily decision to believe that a person's worth is no larger than their uniform, their income, or the dirt on their boots. Julian Thorne's contempt for Raymond Vance was not an isolated mistake, but the natural posture of a man who believed that money bought immunity from the laws of physics, ethics, and human dignity. By refusing to let $40 million override 3 millimeters of shifted steel, Ray Vance proved that true authority does not come from a corner office or a press release, but from the quiet, uncompromising discipline of a person who understands their work and stands by it when the storm comes down the gorge. Justice in this story did not arrive through a sudden miracle or a loud public humiliation, but through the iron reality of a switch set true by a man who refused to leave his post. This story is a work of fiction, created to carry a truth that plays out every single day in dispatch towers, maintenance hangars, security checkpoints, and hospital bays across this country. Systems do not keep us safe on their own. They rely, far more than we like to admit, on ordinary, unglamorous people who show up in the dark, do the work with meticulous care, and absorb the contempt of those who think they are above the rules. The lesson of Trestle 4 is simple. You don't need a fortune, a title, or a high-profile platform to hold the line for the people around you. You just need the courage to master your craft. Hold your ground when the pressure mounts. And remember that the steel never lies. So let me ask you, and I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. When was the last time you stood in your own version of that dispatch tower holding a line for safety? Truth, or basic human dignity, while someone with more power or money tried to force you to look the other way. What did you do, and what gave you the strength to stand your ground? If this story spoke to you today, please share it with someone who works an unglamorous shift. Leave a like to help us reach more people who need this reminder. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of dignity, strength, and quiet integrity. Until next time, keep your eyes on the rails. Stand firm when the wind howling down your valley tries to push you off the beam. And remember, the track doesn't care who built the engine. It only cares if the switches are set true.